Hello friends, this is Growl. Patch 9.2 was just revealed, and with it comes a lot of big announcements about the state of the game. I'm not going to do a reaction video. I know a lot of other creators have done one of those, but I mainly want to focus my attention on one specific change. Although it wasn't demonstrated in the official videos, in a later interview the WoW team revealed that there are plans for 2 equipable legendaries at once during patch 9.2. There is a catch though. One of them has to be your Covenant specific legendary that was released in patch 9.1. I want to do some theory crafting in this video where we talk about what cool double legendary combos there'll be for healers in 9.2. And there's going to be timestamps in the description for each one. First though, I want to talk a little bit about the system and address some thoughts that I've been hearing in my stream chat. It was clear from the first patch of Shadowlands that everyone sort of expected double Legos to be a thing. From the first month of the game, I've been asked so many times, so what combos do you think will be awesome when we can equip 2 legendaries at once? The idea was pretty foreign to me. Since I haven't played Legion, I've never really experienced what a double legendary system would be like. From my impression, it just wasn't going to be a thing. There was a bunch of classes that had really insane combos that would be completely busted, while others had virtually no synergy at all. I didn't even give it much thought until patch 9.1 with their Covenant specific legendary powers. Blizzard's answer to people fiending for the double legendary powers was the Covenant specific powers. These were a separate set of legendaries designed with the currently existing powers in mind. They only really interacted with the Covenant abilities and could easily be mixed and matched with some of the other powers if they wanted to down the line. I sort of saw the writing on the wall when these got released that this is probably how they were going to introduce multiple powers in 9.2. However, a lot of people aren't super excited about this answer. The main problem with this is that although it opens some new doors, it also closes some others. In a way, it actually isn't even the ability to choose 2 legendaries, since one of them is just chosen for you based off of your Covenant. Imagine instead you can only use 1 Lego, and then they just massively buffed all of the Covenant abilities for all the classes. I mean, that's what they did, right? I mean, it's definitely a little bit underwhelming, but at the same time, I think it's the only way that this system might exist. The legendary system, at least the one that was put in place when Shadowlands released, wasn't built to handle multiple powers to begin with. I'm hopeful that the 9.2 patch will come with a really big balance update that changes up a lot of the legendaries, buffing some of the less strong ones and making it so it isn't just a matter of like equipping the same Lego that you already had and then getting your Covenant boost and then you're good to go. That being said, I think it's very possible that we end up with very similar tuning that we have now. It's kind of 50-50 honestly, since a patch would be really nice and a big balance update would be nice. At the same time, the balance of the game is somewhat reasonable right now, and something like that would be a big overhaul of the current system. I do think it's still interesting though to talk about some of the combination of powers that I'd be using right now if I could. I'm going to go down the list. I'll just log into each my healer and we can just look at the powers and talk about them. I'm going to start with the healers that I play the most and then go to the ones I play the least. I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on what you think the best double legendary combos are, especially for like the ones that I play less often, you know, some of the off-meta healers or Covenants. Like, do you guys think you have some sort of secret tech, some big Covenant that a lot of people are sleeping on that's going to be good in the next patch? Let me know in the comments, but let's be honest, the top comment is just going to be something about Venthyr Holy Paladins needing a nerf. So anyway, speaking of Venthyr Holy Paladins, let's take a look at my thoughts on Paladin Legos. So I think there's 2 different ways that we can go down here. Now, I'm going to always go to all specs because remember, you can always use different spec Legos. And when you have double Legos, there may be some combinations where you want to do that. That being said, I think the most obvious Paladin route is going to be Radiant Embers with Venthyr, just because Venthyr is already so strong. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Ashen Hollow or this somehow gets nerfed, but right now, the biggest problem with Radiant Embers, why you didn't see people using it, it increases Ashen Hollow's duration by 50%, which you'd think would be amazing. But here's the problem, is that you pair Ashen Hollow with your wings, right? And your wings gives you a huge damage and healing buff while you have that Ashen Hollow going. But when you get a longer Ashen Hollow, you can't just have wings during that whole time as well, unless you get lucky with procs. Well, with the Mad Paragon Lego that extends the duration of wings, now this combination of, well, Mad Paragon lets you extend your wings and Radiant Embers lets you have a longer Ashen. I think this is going to be a really, really nasty combo, and I think Paladins are still going to be blasting. Also, this is a really good option because this helps healing too. I ran Radiant Embers sometimes in keys to try it out, and it actually is really good as like a safety measure in those really, really tough pulls or bosses where you just need a really big, you know, blanket Ashen, and you know, it's really, really good on both sides. Another option is the Kyrian path as well. I know a lot of Paladins have been liking Kyrian. Most of the Paladins that play Kyrian, I don't think play the Kyrian Lego, so this is just going to be a straight buff. It gives you extra Holy Shocks when you press your Divine Toll, and there's a lot of synergy going on with this. So first of all, the most obvious one is Shock Barrier. Now this is going to be a defensive only Lego, but this is going to put out a ton of healing. I feel like especially in Raid, this might even be the most powerful HPS option if you do Shock Barrier plus the Kyrian Lego. On top of that, it lets you go 50-50. Let's say you're playing Kyrian because you want a little bit of safety, you don't want to play Venthyr and keys. However, you do want to try and do a little bit of single target damage. You can try some other options. You can play this Kyrian Lego plus Mad Paragon, and it won't feel as bad since you have a little bit extra healing. Or you could even play, I know some have been playing the double Hammer of Wrath Lego, or, you know, anything really. You could try a lot of the different options. I think, to be honest, I would imagine most people playing Kyrian are just going to play Shock Barrier just for that extra safety, even though it's not going to be as high of a DPS option as its Venthyr counterpart. And I made the great decision of, I started looking for somewhere to shoot this, and then I realized that I'm just going to be logging out of characters and switching anyway, so I'm like, yeah, we'll just start shooting it on the flight path. So let's hearth home and let's log into our Shaman. Similar to Paladin, I feel like Shaman is sort of pigeonholed in a way. I hope that Shaman gets some tuning to some of its other Legos. However, because the Kyrian Lego is mostly good for Mythic Plus, I think we'll sort of, I don't know if we'll see much Shaman tuning. In Raid, actually, Shaman, like a lot of the different covenants are pretty reasonable. And so I think in Mythic Plus, we're just going to see mostly Kyrian again. The biggest problem with Shaman Legos, especially with the Kyrian Shaman Lego, is there's not a lot of synergy in the current Legos with this, right? Like, essentially the two most common Legos in season 1, you saw Deep Tremor Stone. This was just a bunch of damage and it did almost nothing else. And Raging Vesper Vortex does a little bit of healing, but more or less you're doing this for damage, right? So the most common pairing I think we might see is Raging Vesper Vortex with Deep Tremor. However, it's a little bit uninspiring in Mythic Plus, right? Because it just does a lot of damage and it doesn't really add much versatility or help in, you know, other things. But at the same time, part of that is just speaks for Shaman's really strong kit. Shaman can heal really well outside of cooldowns. It also has a lot of really strong cooldowns, so it doesn't necessarily need its legendary power to be able to do a lot of healing. That being said, you can go 50-50 again, right? Sort of like the Kyrian option. Shaman has the ability to play. You can play this Raging Vesper Vortex for the extra damage, but you don't necessarily have to play a DPS Lego, right? You could go back to something like Primal Tide Core for a little bit of extra healing, Spirit Walker's Tidal Totem for another extra cooldown, or even something that might be interesting is Chains of Devastation, just because you are pressing Chain Heal, or not Chain Heal, but Chain Lightning a lot now, and especially, you know, trying to do big AoE damage with Vesper Vortex. So maybe Chains of Devastation might, while it maybe isn't the most effective option, it's definitely pretty fun. As for Raid, I didn't play a lot of Resto Shaman in Raid this tier. I know there's a few different options. I'd imagine that we're probably going to see Primal Tide Core as like the default Raid Lego, and then in combination with whatever Covenant you play. I know some people were playing Night Fae, some people were playing Kyrian, some people were playing Necrolord still, and I think we'll probably just see Primal Tide Core in combination with the Covenant Lego. It's a little bit, you know, less interesting in that regard, but there are some cool situational options. While well, none of them really synergize that well. You know, you can sort of pick and choose what you want to use, assuming that you have the Legos available to you. You know, let's say you don't care about healing and you just need damage, you can run Deep Tremor, you can run something a little bit defensive, you know, whatever you decide. Hey, oh, it's bursting week, I want to run Jonats for whatever reason. Like, there's lots of different situations where you might see, you know, oh, you want a little bit more tank healing, you can run Earthen Harmony. While shamans aren't the strongest or the most synergistic, they are kind of situational and you can pick and choose, assuming that, I don't know how much friction there'll be with choosing those legendary powers and how you make the Legos, but something to consider. We'll decide if we talk about Discipline or Holy Priest depending on what spec we log into when we go in our character. I think we were in Holy, if I remember. So we may talk about Holy first. So Holy has been kind of in an interesting state when it comes to Legos and Covenants. And by interesting, I mean like completely the opposite of interesting. It's actually really boring. Essentially, the biggest problem with Holy, I think, this expansion is just that the Covenant abilities don't really synergize with it that well. And you have Flash Concentration, which is a pretty fun and pretty powerful Lego, but other than that, you know, we've basically seen Holy Priest run only Flash Concentration the whole expansion, and you know, your Covenant really doesn't matter. And with double Legos, I don't think that'll change much. It feels like most of the Covenants, you know, especially looking at things like Mind Games or the Kyrian Boon, most of them are designed with Discipline or Shadow in mind, and they kind of like left Holy by the wayside. And looking at some of these legendaries, a little bit uninspiring. I initially thought that the Necrolord ability, Pallid Command, would be good. This was something that we played in MDI as Shadow because it does a lot of strong priority damage if you have like a big AoE pull. But no, I haven't played this, but from my understanding, your guy only heals if you're a Holy Priest. He doesn't actually do damage. So while I initially thought this might be a cool combo, that Holy Priest can actually catch up a little bit in damage and put out that like burst priority damage to help their team. This I haven't used this ability, so maybe someone can correct me in the comments, but I think if you use Pallid Command on a Holy Priest, it only heals. I haven't been in the situation where I have 48 renown and the legendary stuff to test it, but that's my understanding of it. I think as Holy, you know, you're probably going to end up still with Flash Concentration and then probably just go with Sphere's Harmony. As clunky as Boon feels, it's essentially just going to be a DPS button, just because all of, like, Holy's already a really good healer and none of the Covenants are really that inspiring, so you're probably just going to run Kyrian with Kyrian Boon just to do a little bit of extra damage. Who knows, you know, maybe that might catch Holy Priest up. But the problem is, I feel like I would say a decent chunk of Holy Priests probably don't care as much about damage. You know, let's say you're pushing really high Mythic Plus keys and you're really trying to go fast. Yeah, obviously damage is going to matter some, but for 95+% of people that play Holy Priest, maybe even more, who just want kind of an interesting way to interact with their character, all these other legendaries are kind of like, eh, you know. So unfortunately, not a lot to say about Holy Priest. Who knows, maybe there'll be some secret build. Maybe there'll be some secret awesome build that people run, but I think you'll still be stuck with staring at your Flash Concentration stacks for the rest of the expansion. Looking at Disc Priest, I think it's somewhat similar in that it's pretty narrow. Sphere's Harmony like completely changed how Discipline worked just because it's so powerful. Before, you saw a lot of different options for what Covenant Disc would play, but now they just only play Kyrian, and this is not going to change that much. I think we're going to see every Disc play Kyrian, at least in PvE content. In terms of your next Lego, I think you have a couple different options. So the first obvious one was the one that people used before the Kyrian one, the double PI. This will be nice because you can get that PI buff on yourself while you're using Boon. You know, you're PIing your ally during Boon, and then you're also getting yours, and you're doing a lot of group damage, which is nice. However, I do think there's a few other legendaries that might be reasonable. The Penance Lego is like sort of a one that's worth noting. If you feel like you don't get great uses out of your PI, this is just like a fire and forget one that's okay. I also think Kiss of Death is pretty interesting. I'd like to see how much damage you could be dealing with Kiss of Death and the Kyrian Lego. I feel like this would actually add quite a bit of damage if you're spamming Shadow Word Death in your rotation. And I think this is like, it's hard to say this early, but I feel like this might be the move in really high keys when you're trying to push out damage. Also, I've found Kiss of Death is a really fun Lego to play. Early in beta for Shadowlands, this was really strong, and a lot of people played this. And to be honest, this was my favorite. And on top of that, honestly, you could play different weird stuff as well. I'm sure there's, you know, like, as silly as it sounds to play something like Vault of Heavens or Crystalline Reflection, I feel like your second Lego as Disc Priest won't matter too much. The most important one by far is your Sphere's Harmony. So similar to Shaman in a way, you can kind of just pick and choose depending on your situation. And who knows, maybe there might be some combos that are good. But I don't think we'll see much of any of the really other Covenants. You know, maybe there might be some situations where you want to play Night Fae, but man, Kyrian Disc is just so strong. Now for the Druid, I feel like the Druid has the most interesting sort of like grouping of different combinations, and there's a lot of different stuff that Druid can do here. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some sort of buffs to Resto Druid, and in combination with some of these double Legos, or maybe they get a nice tier set. I think actually there's potential for Druid to be pretty good. I think that would be a really fun end to the expansion if Druid ends up being a really good Mythic Plus healer and I get to play that for another season. So the first obvious combination is going to be the short cooldown Convoke with basically anything, right? So short cooldown Convoke is like a nice quality of life Lego, but it doesn't really add that much since it's making your Convokes weaker. That being said, now you can combine it with something like, gosh, I don't even have my legendaries unlocked on my poor Druid. Something like Oath of the Elder Druid. This is going to give you Heart of the Wild once a minute, and while this wasn't super powerful, now if you can combine Heart of the Wild with every single one of your Convokes in Moonkin form, you might actually be able to put out a decent amount of damage if you're getting, you know, Moons or Starfalls with that Heart of the Wild. So this could be a really, really strong combo. On top of that, if you just wanted to be more healing focused, Celestial Spirits plus anything else, like any of the other healing Legos, like the first one that comes to mind is Verdant Infusion. Celestial Spirits gives you a really, really strong 1 minute cooldown heal, and then Verdant Infusion gives you a really, really strong single target heal. So I actually think Druids will be really strong 5-man healers again. It might seem like they're a little bit behind. They don't have those like high punch heals sort of that like a Shaman or a Paladin might. But I think with a really short cooldown Convoke and Verdant Infusion, you can be putting out a crazy amount of heals. And on top of that, you could just run something else with Celestial Spirits, right? You could run Circle of Life and Death just to do a little bit more damage. It's always an option. Unfortunately, I know there were some people playing Necrolord. Adaptive Swarm, this sort of defeats the purpose, or Locust Swarm, sorry. The whole idea behind Adaptive Swarm is that you're doing increased single target damage, and Locust Swarm splits into 2 swarms, and that's not really something that you care about that much. So unless there's some sort of other synergy, I think this is like probably the least appealing one. However, for single target damage, Sinful Hysteria might be okay. So before you would play Necrolord and you would play Deep Focus, now you could actually play Deep Focus with Sinful Hysteria and use these in combination as like a really strong 3-minute burst cooldown. I don't know if it's going to be good. That's going to be one of those things where you might just have to sort of sim. It may depend on trinkets and tier sets and all that kind of stuff, but who knows, like maybe there's some sort of combination here where you can actually do like very, very high single target damage to every boss to make Druid a little bit more appealing. Also, we saw the Surgence of Kyrian Druids. A lot of people playing this legendary, Kindred Affinity. A lot of people have been asking me about it too, because they see some top Resto Druids and Keys and an MDI running this one, and they're like, hey, what do you think about this? And it's like, well, the biggest problem with this Lego is it doesn't really help you that much. Like, yeah, it gives you stats, but, you know, a small amount of stats isn't going to help that much compared to some of the other buffs that you can get from your Legos. So if you wanted to play it, you could, but it's not going to be the most fun build, and it may not be effective. You know, if you're bonding with a random person in a 15 key and they're a monkey and they're doing tank damage, like you're kind of losing out on a lot of the value, you know. But with Kindred Affinity, you can pair that with anything else, right? So now if you're Kyrian, you just get Kindred Affinity for free, which is actually kind of crazy because it is a pretty big buff to your teammate as well. for group damage. And so you play Kindred Affinity and you have access to all of these. So if you decide you want to, you know, you miss that really strong single target healing, or, you know, you feel like you have less healing with Kyrian, you can play VI, or you could just play Deep Focus again for damage, or Circle for damage. So there's a lot of options now with Kyrian Druid, and I think Kyrian Druid might be more reasonable to play in Pugs. Before I sort of saw it as like a, you know, you probably only want to do it with a good group sort of thing. But if this is more your style, or let's say you play Bear and you know you want to just try Kyrian Resto or whatever in a key, I think it's a lot more reasonable as well. Last but not least, the Mistweaver. Mistweaver is really funny because Mistweaver has some of the best healing Legos there are. Like, the Mistweaver healing Legos are absolutely crazy, and the idea of combining some of these Legos, the amount of throughput you're going to do is insane. I think this is going to be the first tier in a long time where it's pretty reasonable that we might see a Mistweaver on the world first kill, just because of how much raw healing they're doing. Like, they are doing so much healing right now, and a lot of that has to do with this new Venthyr Lego, Sinister Teachings. It essentially resets the cooldown of your Fallen Order whenever you crit. So the idea is you just stack a bunch of crit and you're using the Sinister Teachings, and you essentially are in your Fallen Order like most of the fight, or a lot of your fight, which is really, really cool. It does have an ICD, so it doesn't reset infinite, but it's something cool to consider. The other alternatives that Mistweaver had, so Tear of the Morning was a really, really strong healing legendary as well. I'd say it's mostly only in situations where you're using Vivify a lot, and so the Sinister Teaching build doesn't exactly synergize a lot with Tear of the Morning. That being said, like, if you're somehow either getting a lot of innervates, or you have some other way that you can get a lot of mana, or if it's a shorter fight and you're spamming a lot of Vivify or Renewing Mist, I think Tear of the Morning could still be really strong. The other one that is the obvious contender, right, is Ancient Teachings. Ancient Teachings puts out a ton of healing, and it lets you sort of streamline your rotation where you're mostly DPSing, and you can just DPS through 80 to 90% of the encounter, and it sort of is just doing a lot of passive healing. Mistweaver right now is sort of like this weird passive healer where you're just like kicking the boss in the head and you don't really do anything to your teammates, but you're still doing just a whole ton of healing. And the combination of Sinister Teachings with Ancient Teachings, you're going to be doing just so much healing. The one downside is that Ancient Teachings doesn't work with Spinning Crane Kick, unlike, you know, some other renditions of it in previous expansions. So while a lot of the times, especially on AoE, you're spamming a lot of Spinning Crane Kick with Sinister Teachings, you're not going to be wanting to do that with Ancient Teachings, but it's still going to increase your healing a lot. The biggest downside is that, well, Mistweaver is already a really good healer, right? Like, you're sort of doubling down on your strengths here, but one of the reasons that you don't see it is because it doesn't have that good damage and sort of passive. It has a little bit of passive damage, I guess, you know, a reasonable amount if you consider the Mystic Touch buff, the increased physical damage as well, but there aren't really any good DPS Legos that you can pair with Sinister Teachings for Mythic Plus. Some people are talking about Invoker's Delight. It gives you a big haste buff. I mean, here's the thing, is when you have your Celestial out and Sinister Teachings is active, or even just your Celestial, you're already doing a ton of healing anyway, right? You don't necessarily need this. Like, maybe in a raid I could see this doing a lot of healing. Like, thinking back, Invoker's Delight plus Sinister Teachings and raid might be stronger than Sinister Teachings and Ancient Teachings. But this doesn't really help your damage. Like, even though 33% haste might seem like a lot, when you're doing 0 damage, it doesn't really help your damage that much. You could do something like, I know some people wanted to try like Fatal Touch or some of these other options, but unfortunately Mistweaver is sort of pigeonholed into this role of, it's just like a power healer. You just do a ton of healing, ton of passive healing to everyone, but its damage numbers quite aren't there. I don't really know how they could balance it at this point. I feel like it just sort of stuck in this role for the expansion. I don't necessarily hate it. It's a fun class. I feel like it's strong in raids. You do a lot of healing. It's reasonable in Mythic Plus. You know, again, if you're doing 28 keys and you care a lot about your healer doing a ton of damage, then yeah, it might not be the best choice. But in something like a weekly 15 and even all the way to like a 20 or a 22 or something, it's like having a healer that does a lot of healing, whether it's AoE, passive, single target, like Mistweaver does it all. Having a healer like that is actually a pretty good thing. So I don't think it's necessarily bad that this is the case. It's, you know, it's going to mean that we're not going to see a lot of Mistweavers in the very top of the ladder. And I know a lot of people sort of look at, oh, these are the healers. Oh, everyone's playing X healer in MDI, or everyone's playing X healer in the top keys. And while that is a thing, and I guess you could say that that makes it the best healer, it doesn't necessarily mean it's like the best design or the best healer for everybody. Another option that I think is maybe fun. Do I even have it unlocked? Oh, I have it on Mistweaver. Let's see if I can find it. It is Kiefer's. So I actually saw this power first in Torghast, giving Tiger Palm a 10-yard range, and it like dashes you towards your target. Honestly, this is so fun. If you never picked this power in Torghast, just try it out. Anytime I saw this, I'm like, man, this would be really, really fun to have in keys. So I think the increase in critical strike chance might be some cool synergy with the Sinister Teachings Lego. I don't know if it's going to be enough. You know, it really feels like it's designed around Windwalker. Like 50% crit for 6 seconds I don't think is very powerful for Mistweaver, but the 10-second teleport on Tiger Palm is so ridiculously fun that it may be something that I craft on my Mistweaver just to do keys next season anyway. I think just because it's just a cool, fun thing to play around with. So that wraps up my summary and my thoughts on kind of the new system, how the double legendaries are going to play out, and some of the combos that I think were cool. I asked for help from some of my stream chat and Discord friends about what they thought. If you guys think I missed anything, again, I'd love to hear it in the comments, and you guys can come back to this video in 6 months when, you know, everyone's playing the Necrolord Druid Lego and, you know, the Kyrian Mistweaver Lego, and call me an idiot. So take it easy, friends, and happy keying.